McCuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Do you remember when universities and other schools used to be focused on education and the free and open discussion of all issues? Do you remember when political correctness was not in your vocabulary? And just what is the purpose of education anyway? We'll discuss these issues with our experts, and here in the studio with me is my co-host Jim Falk. Jim, welcome back to the program.
Always good to be with you.
Jim is the CEO and the president of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth, so glad to have you here.
Great, thank you.
And joining us actually via Skype is Samantha Harris. She's the Vice President for Procedural Matters at FIRE, which is the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. It's a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization defending and sustaining the individual rights of students and faculty members at America's colleges and universities. Sam, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we'll be back with you in just a minute. And here in the studio, first is Sheen Levine. He's a management professor at the Jindal School of Management at the University of Texas at Dallas, and he also has an arrangement with Columbia University, which I think is in some other state, which we won't mention. So Sheen, welcome to the program.
Thank you, happy to be here.
And next to you is Yoram Solomon. He's the founder of Trust Building Institute. He's a former Plano Independent School District trustee, and he's an adjunct professor at SMU now, formerly UTD, and also involved with Hadassah Academic College in Jerusalem. Finally, he's the author of a book called Cause of Death, Political Corrections, I should say. Correctness, yes, if I could say it right. How and why political correctness kills creativity, productivity, and children, which is a very provocative title. So before we get to universities, Yoram, you have some experience obviously in K-12. I assume that's totally an absence of bias in those schools. Is that true?
Well, that's what I thought, at least in the first 20 days after I got elected in May of 2015, because the first thing that happened is I got to participate in graduation. I gave away diplomas, and one of my friend's sons had just got his diploma, and we were at their house, and he started telling me about the atmosphere in one of his classes. So he just graduated, this is his senior class, and he was talking about very, very strong bias. And for the next 4 years that I served on that board, that was one of my pet peeves. How do we get away from that bias, especially since we actually had a policy against exactly that kind of bias?
And what was the bias about?
Well, the bias was political. The teachers had a very specific point of view, and I'm not going to go into which one. But students realized very quickly that if you answer the question on a test or on an assignment with a certain political position, you would succeed. If you answered with the opposite, you would fail. Now, students, they have only one goal in life. This is not to run for office. It is to get high grades. And they very quickly realized, they're very adaptable. They realized that, oh, this is how things are in this class. This is how I'm going to answer questions, without realizing that their brains are being washed.
Yeah. Sheen, I'm sure that doesn't work in your classroom, does it?
My classrooms are open, and we get into some heated conversations and debates.
Which is a good thing.
It's a very good thing.
Yeah.
Cognitive diversity, a variety of opinions, is critical for reaching the truth. And I think we should be concerned if we are lacking in cognitive diversity. But that's very different from ethnic and racial diversity, which is what people often mention when they talk about diversity, and something that me and my research team have been studying extensively.
Good, I appreciate that. You want to bring Sam in?
I do. Samantha, tell us about some of the challenges that you're seeing now on university campuses.
You know, I think one of the biggest challenges we're seeing is sort of from students often what I would call a lack of intellectual humility. Which is, students who feel like they're there to teach rather than to learn, and then too little courage often from administrators and sometimes from faculty who are afraid to push back against student demands for censorship. So I can get into that in a little bit more depth if you'd like, or if you just want to lead off, I can sort of leave the finer points of that for later on.
Well, do they feel pressure, as you mentioned, to sort of be close to the professors and agree with them to help with their grades?
You know, it's interesting. I'm sure that in some instances is the case, but we are dealing more these days with instances of faculty who are facing complaints from students for not addressing materials in a sufficiently sensitive way, or teaching controversial issues in any way that sort of diverges from the prevailing orthodoxy. And so what we've seen, and this has been a change, I've been at FIRE for 15 years, and there's been a shift in this regard. But I would say right now, we are dealing more with faculty who are on the receiving end of censorship and demands for firing and things like that from students, and dealing with administrations that too often are not willing to stand up for the rights of their faculty.
That's very interesting, Sam. And we had the opportunity to interview Charles Murray a couple of years ago, and we asked him, among other things, what the purpose of education was. So when we're ready, let's run that clip.
In terms of universities where the free speech issue has been centered, look, the purpose of a university is to expose people to different ideas argued with evidence and logic, as far as I'm concerned. And if I were a president of a university, I would not feel compelled to give a platform to somebody that I thought was really reprehensible. I want to augment the experience of my students. But within that criterion, what I want is a speaker who's coming on campus, has logic and evidence, and civility, which I think is important. And in that case, I back off from saying, well, I'm not going to have this person because I disagree with him. Now, it's my obligation as university president to provide that place with a safe haven.
Yeah, and so one of the things that he talked about, of course, is that we're looking, as you said, for diversity of opinion, but it may be, when we talk about diversity, it's sometimes a little bit difficult. You interviewed a guy yesterday.
I met with, or talked with Tony Kroneman. He's just written a remarkable book. It's called The Assault on American Intelligence, and he was Dean of Yale Law School. And we spoke about diversity, and he has a very specific definition of it. So let's listen to that.
I'm all for diversity when it comes to deciding which kids out of the huge number that apply for the scarce spots at a college or university to admit. I'm all for picking them with an eye to building a diverse class. I think a diverse student body is a wonderful thing. I can't imagine, I walk across my own campus here and I see kids of all different sorts. I imagine them coming from all sorts of different backgrounds. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. The problem is, in my view, the fusion of diversity in one particular sense, the sense which has become predominant in our way of thinking about it in higher education, namely diversity of race, ethnicity, and gender. The fusion of diversity in that sense with individual belief, worldview, outlook, attitude, and the like. When those two things become too tightly connected, individual students begin to think of themselves first and most importantly as members of groups and not as individuals struggling in the way we all do to find our way in the world and figure out what we believe, not as an X or a Y or a Z, but as the absolutely unique one-off that every one of us is. That's what college ought to do, to liberate young people who have all sorts of identities, to think first and most importantly about themselves as absolutely unique individuals trying to figure out which of their inheritances they want to embrace and affirm.
So Sheen, how do you view with what the professor has said there?
So often when we talk about diversity, we talk indeed about diversity of gender, of race, of ethnicity. I began studying diversity not because I'm a diversity scholar. I was interested in a completely different question. I was interested in understanding how come bad ideas spread. Why do intelligent people adopt counterfactual beliefs? All the more urgent now with fake news, etc. And so we looked at a situation in which people must make good decisions. We looked at people that were adept in economics and finance, and we asked them to trade financial assets to make money. In this situation, when you see someone else making a mistake, you don't copy their mistake, you take advantage of their mistake to buy on the cheap or to sell dearly. To our surprise, we saw that these people, instead of exploiting their competitors' mistakes, embraced them, adopted them, and started recreating those mistakes. And so we went deeper to understand, how does that happen? Why do intelligent people that are out there to make money would copy other people's mistakes? We realized that an important part of that was racial or ethnic homogeneity. So when the market was composed of traders that looked like each other very superficially, they were much more likely to copy other people's mistakes. When we threw in people that looked differently, mistakes did not spread as quickly. People scrutinized other people's actions and were much less likely to copy their mistakes. So our argument is different from the typical argument about diversity. Granted, the argument out there is if you bring in people that have different ethnicities or different races or different genders, you'll somehow come up with better ideas. The scientific evidence on that is mixed. Our perspective is that diversity makes people brighter, not necessarily because they bring something different or new to the table, but because it disrupts conformity. It disrupts a natural tendency to agree with other people.
You know, that's an interesting concept, and Yoram, it seems to me it really plays into your political correctness, because if we're trying to keep from being conformed, it looks like political correctness tries to make us conform, doesn't it?
Right. Not only that it does that, but if you think about the First Amendment. The First Amendment focused, when the authors of the First Amendment wrote it, they focused on your free speech. But what about your obligation to get the other side of an argument? One of the biggest problems we have today is that given that I conform with this one group that I belong to, I don't listen to opposite opinions. I don't believe that there is another side to an argument. And the problem is, if I don't know that there is another side to an argument, how do I know that I'm right? How do I know if I'm wrong?
Well, because the people in my tribe agree with me. That's how I know I'm right.
Let's listen to what Samantha has to say, because FAR has been very active in promoting what's called the Chicago Statement. Samantha, tell us more about that.
Yeah, so, one of the things that I think is essential for universities to do to ensure that colleges can remain a marketplace for ideas is to take a strong stance for freedom of expression and make clear that attempts at censorship won't be tolerated. And one important way they can do this is to stand up for faculty and students who find themselves in trouble for their free expression. A great example of this was Camille Paglia, feminist professor at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia, who's made some remarks recently about sexual assault and the Me Too movement that angered a lot of students and prompted students to petition the university for her to be fired. And the president of the university pushed back in no uncertain terms, and he said, quote, "Artists over the centuries have suffered censorship and even persecution for the expression of their beliefs through their work. My answer is simple: not now, not at UArts." Now, that kind of strong leadership is too rare, and it's something we need. But universities don't have to wait for a controversy like that to arise to reaffirm a strong stance in favor of free expression. In fact, it's often easier to have a strong statement in support of free expression in place to refer back to when controversies arise. And that's where the Chicago Statement comes in. In 2015, the University of Chicago came out with a really strong statement in support of free expression that other universities have since begun to adopt. And FIRE has a big campaign. We've been working with a lot of universities to adopt this. And since 2015, when the University of Chicago first issued this statement, 67 other institutions, including one in Texas, UT San Antonio, have adopted that statement. And that statement both says that you can't suppress speech just because other people find it offensive or wrong, and that the university has a responsibility to protect the freedom of speech when other people try to restrict it.
So
I
why have some universities been hesitant to sign this statement?
Well, that's a good question. Unfortunately, the issue of free speech on campus has become very politicized. And universities are often criticized when they defend the right to free speech as, well, taking a stance, they're supporting X or Y, whatever kind of bad speech people don't want on campus. And I think, unfortunately, it goes back to what I was saying before about a lack of courage on the part of a lot of college and university administrators. I think that there are a lot of people out there who would privately agree that there really is a problem with free speech and open expression on campus, but who are afraid to speak up about it, because of this sort of cancel culture that we have, because if you're perceived as supporting even the right of people to express offensive views, you often find yourself being tagged as a supporter of those views and called out, and people are afraid of that. So I think,
Samantha, I'm shocked that you would say there's politicization on college campus. I'm shocked that you would say that. Let me show you something that might make that point, however. We had the opportunity to interview Charles Murray. You saw a clip of his earlier. Let's look at this clip now about what happened to him at Middlebury College a couple of years ago.
It has a totalitarian undertone to it, so that it is wrong to say things which go against what we have decided is right. It is impermissible, and they see that as a kind of moral principle, I think.
Tell that viewer what happened to you at Middlebury College in March of 2017.
Big surprise. Well, the first part of it was that I was shouted down when I tried to give the lecture. I stood up there for 25 minutes, and it was obvious they were not going to stop chanting. And so then I went to another room with Allison Stanger, a professor there, who was going to do the Q&A, and we streamed a version of the lecture with a lot of difficulty since fire alarms are going off and people are yelling and screaming. And the dramatic part came when we tried to leave the building, and there were outside the guys in ski masks and the Antifa kind of group and others who assaulted us as we tried to go to the car. And when I say assault, I don't mean verbal. Allison Stanger sustained a concussion. She sustained a neck injury that has still not healed, and we're talking 8 months later. It was, it's odd, Dennis. What happened in trying to get to the car, that was a crime. And somebody ought to be doing jail time for what they did to Allison Stanger. In a way, the worst offense was in the lecture hall when I couldn't give an ordinary college-style lecture on the premises of one of the elite small colleges in the country. That was the sad part of the day.
Yeah, and Sheen, we haven't seen that obviously here on our campus, but it's happened in a lot of campuses. Do you have any connections in people around the country who've seen this sort of thing happen? And what would you say to a student or another faculty member if something like this happened on your campus?
I keep hearing about it, as you do, and I'm concerned about it. I'm also concerned about the entanglement of diversity and freedom of speech. Diversity is not antithesis to freedom of speech. Rather, diversity should enable the exchange of opinions, the exchange of views. It should encourage people to disagree. And this is what our research shows is the main contribution of diversity. Diversity begets good ideas because it encourages people to disagree.
Yeah.
One of the problems that in my opinion, universities are so afraid to get sued. That's really, if the US is leading the world in something, it's the percentage of our GDP that we spend on civil litigation. Because we spend more than Canada, the UK, the entire European Union, and Japan combined twice on civil litigation. So universities are afraid of getting sued. Well, but the worst part of it is that they're telling you, the student, that you should be offended by something that I say. And as a result, if I say something to offend you without any intention, it is 100% your decision to get offended. and then you take it personal, you become emotional, you become irrational with absolutely no value to you. Frankly, even if I said something to offend you intentionally, it is 100% your intention. Yeah. But the universities tell you that you should be offended.
This should be the very place in which this sort of free expression should be encouraged. Am I right about this? And that's the thing that I think is frightening to me and to all of us here, and hopefully that viewer as well, because I forget who it was that said, freedom of speech is easy when somebody says something you agree with. The test is when somebody says something that is so abhorrent to you, and you have to continue to say, I disagree with what you say, but I must say that you have the right to say it.
Well, we've moved away from what is was the original intent of universities. And I continued with that discussion with Tony Kroneman, and let's hear what he has to say about the politicization of America's universities.
That's the problem. I love my democratic country. It's wonderful, boisterous public life, which rests on the principle of equality. I love my academic world, which rests on a commitment to excellence and truth. Those are different values. Each has a dignity and nobility of its own. The problem comes when the two are conflated or confused. That's what's happened. These two domains have been blurred in a way that undermines academic life and indirectly undermines our democratic life by discouraging the development of the habits of independent-mindedness that our citizens and leaders need.
Samantha, I read on your website that you actually, at FIRE, rank universities insofar as their freedom of speech. Give us a sense of some universities that score well and others that don't do so well.
Well, so we do have a rating system for universities. That rating system is based on universities' written speech code, which is something that, 15 years ago, 95% of universities had written policies that restricted what would be constitutionally protected speech, or at a public university, what is constitutionally protected speech. So we came up with this rating system. It's a traffic light system, red light, yellow light, green light, to talk about the degree to which a university's policies restrict free speech. And so now, when we started, there were about 8 universities on our list that had a green light. Now there are over 50, which is great. More universities have adopted the Chicago Statement, and more universities have gotten rid of policies that restrict free speech. Unfortunately, practices at universities still have a lot of catching up to do, because sometimes even at green light universities, we see actions taken that are inconsistent with the university's commitments to free speech. So, for example, the University of Pennsylvania has long had a green light because it got rid of all of its speech codes years ago. But after a law professor there, Amy Wax, made some comments on a podcast about affirmative action that angered a lot of Penn Law students and prompted calls for her firing and so on. The dean of Penn Law actually stripped her of her required first-year courses. She's still tenured, she's still teaching, but they took away her ability to teach required courses. So, you have a university that on paper is very committed to free speech, but in practice, that doesn't always hold up. So it's important not only that universities don't have policies restricting free speech, and in fact that they adopt policies promoting free speech, like the Chicago Statement, but that they also live up to those commitments in practice.
Well, that's your university. Let's hear more what your thoughts are.
I'm a proud graduate of the University of Pennsylvania. I'm not entirely familiar with the Amy Wax incident. I heard about it. I would say that I would be concerned by any policy or any practice that limits the diversity of opinions on campus, as I would be concerned with any practice or policy that limits the ethnic or racial diversity on campus.
Yeah, so Yoram, how did we get here? And then finally, what should we do? What should that viewer do? How can anybody impact what's going on here?
Well, I think we have 2 problems. One problem is that we're limiting what we can talk about, because God forbid you're going to be offended by something that I say. But the second problem is that it's not necessarily happening in a symmetrical way. So you can walk into one university or one classroom and get a completely different political position than what you get in another one. I think that trying to legislate our way out of it, trying to create, and I might be a little controversial or contrarian here, trying to legislate our way out of this is not going to work. I think we need to get back into the business of education, where different positions create diversity of thought. They make you think about what the flaws of your own argument is. I think this needs to be motivated. This needs to be at the higher level than what we legislate, than what we put in laws.
Yeah, well, I think that viewer probably knows there's no diversity of thought and political position in today's universities. And some people would say 40 years ago, even though that was the case then, that you didn't have the politicization then, even though the people belong to that sort of part of the deal. So something has happened in the meantime to make this go. What would you say it is, Sheen? We only have about 30 seconds left.
I think we are becoming more polarized, and people now can watch their TV stations that adhere to their political line, follow the Twitter accounts of the people they agree with, and they want the same thing in their classrooms.
Yeah, exactly.
And you see that with your students too?
I occasionally see that. Not often, thankfully.
Yeah. Well, we'd like them to think that we, encourage them to look at all points of view. And for those of us who are sort of anti both political sides, it's easier to do than others, let's say. So, Jim, thank you very much for joining us here as a co-host.
Good to be here.
Yoram, outstanding. And Sheen, thank you for being here at the last minute. Samantha, thank you very much for being here and all the stuff that FIRE is doing. We first had FIRE on our program the first time, I'm going to say, 20 years ago. So thank you for coming back. For you, we hope that we've educated you on this education topic, and we hope you'll keep an open mind to all diverse points of view. Join us on Twitter and check McCuistionTV.com for more information on this and other topics, because as always, we'll be talking about things that matter with people who care.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email Nikki N at NikkiMcCuistion.com. Visit our website at www.McCuistionTV.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McCuistionTV or download McCuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.